Please join me in welcoming Dr. Norton to Charleston as a Drayton Hall Distinguished Speaker with her presentation entitled Beyond Boston, the Fate of the 7 Tea Ships of 1773. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to try to speak without a microphone. Is that okay? I have a loud voice. It's accustomed to speaking in large auditoriums at Cornell. Can people in the back hear me all right? I'm really happy to be here. The weather was terrible in Ithaca today. I'm told it snowed this morning. So I'm glad to be here. And even yesterday, it was a lot better than it's been in Ithaca lately. So I want to start by saying that Americans today believe they are familiar with the narrative and meaning of the event that we commonly call the Boston Tea Party. And here's your first factoid of the evening. It wasn't called that until 1835, when a book was published that used that in the title. Now, the story, as told in popular lore and by the contemporary Tea Party movement, seems simple and straightforward. Of course, historians know nothing is ever simple and straightforward. But the story goes that on the 16th of December, 1773, Bostonians, angry about high taxes that Parliament had placed on the imports of East India Company tea, protested by disguising themselves as Indians, breaking into 3 tea ships and throwing that tea into the harbor. The consequences of the protesters' actions are rarely discussed, nor am I going to say much about them in this lecture, though I'll be happy to answer questions about the consequences later on if you want to ask. Also rarely discussed, and this is really what I'm talking about today, are the other tea incidents of late 1773 and early 1774. So my talk tonight encompasses all 7 of the tea ships that sailed from England to North America in the fall of 1773. One came here to Charleston, and I'm going to say a lot about that. One went to Philadelphia. A third, or a 6th, if you count the 3 in Boston, went to New York. And what of the 7th, you might ask, because the title says the 7 tea ships. Well, I'll recount that story, which is the least known and least studied of all the tea incidents at the end of this talk. Now, it's important for me to start with the observation that the pre-revolutionary tea protests were not what they superficially seem to be, and that the summary I just provided for you is in large part mythical. In fact, Bostonians and the other American colonists who opposed the arrival of tea ships were not protesting higher taxes. They were ironically protesting lower taxes. This may seem counterintuitive, so I will repeat it. The Americans were protesting a recent act of Parliament that lowered the tax that was levied on imported East India Company tea. Now, why would some colonists protest lower taxes? It was because they did not want to admit that Parliament had the right to tax them, and they feared that their fellow colonists would symbolically acknowledge that right by their willingness to pay the tea tax. So if the tax were lower, then people were more likely to buy it, and that would symbolize British authority over America, which is what they were protesting. So this contemporary Tea Party movement, in short, has it wrong historically. The colonists did not protest the amount of the tax. That was not an issue. How much that tax was not an issue. Instead, they denied Parliament's right to tax them in the first place. Adherents of the modern Tea Party don't deny that Congress can tax the American people at all. Instead, they think the taxes are too high and that the federal government supported by those taxes is too large and intrusive. So the analogy is imperfect, to say the least. But you may want to know why Americans remarkably were protesting lower taxes, and so I need to provide you with some introductory background. The tea tax that was at issue here was initially adopted in 1767 as part of a financial package known as the Townsend Duties. To win the 7 Years' War, which protected the North American colonies from attacks by the French and their Indian allies, the British government had run up huge debts. This should be familiar to all of us since it's a major issue in the U.S. today because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Since the colonists had routinely paid customs duties on imports from foreign countries, and the British government needed extra revenue, the Townsend Acts of 1767 laid duties on such items as glass, paper, dyes, and tea. Yet these taxed items were traded within the British Empire rather than being imported from outside it. And that was unique. That had never happened before. The duties had not been paid on items traded within the empire. So colonists protested that such taxes went beyond the trade regulations that they had previously accepted. That is, they had said, well, if the British, if Parliament taxes molasses that we are importing from foreign islands in the Caribbean, then that's okay because that's regulating trade, that's not a tax. But this is a tax, clearly, because it's something that's traded within the empire. So in 1768, they boycotted imports from Britain, and in 1770, the British government repealed most of the duties, but it left the tea tax in place as a symbol of British authority. Some colonists tried to maintain the tea boycott after that point, but they largely failed. The boycott movement fell apart after the other taxes were repealed, even though tea was still taxed. And it fell apart except in New York and Pennsylvania. Keep that in mind for future reference this evening. The New Yorkers and the Pennsylvanians maintained the tea boycott. The Bostonians and the Charlestonians and people in Virginia and so forth did not maintain the tea boycott. Now, a comment about tea, I have to make a comment about tea. It was the favorite hot caffeinated beverage of the 18th century in both England and America. It was widely consumed by people at all levels of society and especially by women. Ownership of tea tables, teapots, and porcelain cups and saucers was a sign of gentility. So in fact, people who have done studies of probate inventories, which is what people owned, the items that people owned in their houses, as soon as a family would get a little bit of disposable income, they would buy a teapot, because that was a sign of gentility. To have a teapot, to be able to entertain your friends at tea, was really important as a socialization effort. So there was a lot of emotion and, shall we say, cultural value attached to tea. Although colonists also drank coffee, the demand for tea was greater, thus producing more revenue for the many merchants who sold it. But in the colonial market, the legally taxed East India Company tea had to compete with tea smuggled in from Holland. So it's not, when they're not drinking the taxed tea, it's not that they're not drinking tea, they're drinking smuggled tea. Now, unsurprisingly, the smuggled commodity tended to be cheaper than East India tea, which was legal, in large part because it didn't pay any taxes. Now, as an aside, I want to really start this little talk by talking about how when I did research here for this project several years ago, one of the most interesting documents I found at the South Carolina Historical Society right down the street was instructions to a Rhode Island captain about how to engage in smuggling tea beginning here in Charleston. There is a document down the street that tells this captain what to do. The owners of the ship directed him to load rice here and to sail to Hamburg, Germany, where he was to sell the rice. Then he was to sail to Gothenburg, Sweden, to purchase tea there. And this was mysterious to me when I read the document, but just a few weeks ago I read an article which said that somehow the tea that got to Sweden was of higher quality than tea went other places. So it was going to be very good tea that he bought in Gothenburg, Sweden. So he was to sail to Gothenburg, Sweden, where he was going to buy the tea, paying for it with the proceeds of the sale of the rice in Hamburg. Then in Gothenburg, the ship owner said, work really quickly to load the tea because authorities in London are going to find out that you're in Gothenburg running, that you're trying to smuggle tea, and we want you to get out of there fast. We don't want them to catch you. So then they said, sail for the Caribbean island of St. Croix with the tea, and he was to sell the tea there. Now, at that time, St. Croix, which is now an American island, of course, part of the American Virgin Islands, was ruled by Denmark. But that wasn't the important part about it. The important part about it is that it was located close to the Dutch islands of St. Martin and St. Eustatius in the northern Caribbean. And St. Eustatius was the smuggling capital of the Caribbean. So even though the letter didn't say what the owners expected to happen to the tea after the captain sold it in St. Croix, it's not hard to imagine two subsequent voyages, one from St. Croix to St. Eustatius and one from St. Eustatius right back here to Charleston, I'll bet you anything. And at the end of this letter, any of you could go see this document. It's just so fantastic. It just goes on and on about all the deception he's supposed to do. The ship owners wished their captain, quote, a prosperous voyage. And I'm sure he had a very prosperous voyage if he did everything that they said they wanted him to do. But of course, I don't know whether he did that. Now, back to this main story. So in 1773, the East India Company, which I will refer to in shorthand as EIC because that's what everybody talked about it. That's how everybody talked about it then, was near bankruptcy because of mismanagement. And the Tea Act of 1773 attempted to rescue it by eliminating a tax paid in England on tea later exported. That's the tax that they're getting rid of. And by also giving the EIC control over the pricing of its tea in America through the use of designated agents. Before, the law said that the EIC had to sell its tea in England at an auction, so it couldn't control the price that it got or what it was sold for. But this law said, no, you don't have to sell the tea at auction anymore. You can just, you designate agents in America to receive the tea, and you can control the price of the tea in America. And it won't include this tax, which they're removing. So the expectation was that this legally taxed tea would be cheaper than smuggled tea, or at least comparably priced, so that people would buy the legally taxed tea rather than the smuggled tea. Now, although the Lord North Ministry did not design the Tea Act of 1773 to force the colonies to accept Parliament's right to tax them, and we know that because nobody talked about this in the debates in Parliament. They didn't say, oh, this is going to be a sneaky way to get the Americans to agree to acknowledge our authority. They didn't say that. They wanted to rescue the East India Company. They had a lot of members of Parliament, guess what, had investments in the East India Company. The East India Company was going bankrupt. They wanted to save it from bankruptcy. So they provided the Tea Act to try to do that. Because a frequently consumed desirable commodity would now probably be cheaper if Americans paid taxes laid by Parliament than if they didn't. And the collapse of the tea boycott in 1770, after most of the Townshend duties were repealed, suggested to colonial leaders that Americans would not resist the lure of cheaper tea. So that sets the stage for the tea incidents of 1773. Now, at the outset, I need to highlight the time lag in the transmission of information back and forth across the Atlantic and up and down the eastern seaboard of North America. Today, we're so accustomed to instant communications. I mean, on my cell phone this afternoon, I got several news alerts about things that happened today. This is not what happened in the 18th century. Most transatlantic vessels sailed to Boston, Philadelphia, or New York. The voyage could take anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the season of the year and the winds and so forth. Once residents in Boston, Philadelphia, or New York learned details of British policy, it could take as long as another month before that information reached Virginia or South Carolina by either private letters or by what was called the public prints, that is, newspapers that were regularly exchanged among printers via the Postal Service. The same time lag, of course, applied to information about events in the northern colonies or the southern colonies. News could be shared among Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York within a week or two. But the lack of good roads farther south hindered the rapid movement of information except by sea and coasting vessels. And you will see that one of the big parts of this story is when colonies learned what was happening in other colonies with respect to the tea and how long the time lag was. So, in fact, it took them months to learn about the passage of the Tea Act itself. The Tea Act of 1773 was adopted by Parliament on the 10th of May. 10th of May. But the first accurate description of its provisions did not appear in colonial newspapers until August and September. So the law is passed in the middle of May, but nobody knows about the details of what it says until August and September, and it's a private letter that tells them. On August 11th, a Philadelphia newspaper published the following extract from a letter written in late May by a Londoner to a resident of Philadelphia. So somebody in late May living in London, actually it's been found out who it was, people who've worked on Philadelphia know who wrote this letter, wrote to a friend in Philadelphia to tell him about the Tea Act. And here's what it says, quote, I take the first opportunity of acquainting you that the East India Company have obtained leave by Act of Parliament to export their teas from England duty-free, and in a short time, perhaps a month, a cargo will be sent by them to Boston, subject to the duty payable in America, to be sold in that place on their account, and they mean to keep America so well supplied that the trade to Holland for that article must be greatly affected, end quote. Now note that the author of this letter had certain details correct. He knew that the tea duties in England had been removed, but that the American duties remained in place, and that the Act's purpose was to undercut the colonial market for smuggled Dutch tea. Still, he made two mistakes. First, he said the tea would be shipped in early summer, and it's actually not shipped until the fall. And second, he thought that only Boston was going to receive the tea. So this is the first accurate news. There were some rumors before, but this is the first detailed, accurate news that people in America got about the Tea Act. And by late September, this letter had been reprinted in newspapers from the north in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, all the way to Charleston. And I followed the reprints of this letter in all these newspapers. Now, I hasten to add, you may wonder, why is a private letter being reprinted in all these newspapers? It's because when a colonist got a letter that contained interesting information, they would pass it on to the printer of the local paper, and then that printer would print it anonymously, an extract of a letter from a gentleman in London to a gentleman in this city. That's pretty standard kind of thing. And that's how a lot of the news came. It wasn't so much official news or London newspapers that came to America. A lot of it was private correspondence, and that's what this letter, of course, was. Now, during the next month, that is, during the month of September and into October, Americans learned that tea was going to come to Philadelphia and New York as well as to Boston. And that news appeared in colonial newspapers from Boston south to Williamsburg. It did not appear in Charleston. It did not appear in Charleston papers. Not until November 15th, remember that date, did a South Carolina newspaper reveal that tea was also coming to Charleston. So, in other words, by August, people knew tea was going to Boston, but it's not until November that people knew that tea was coming to Charleston. People in Charleston knew tea was coming here. Now, Americans' earliest essays attacking the importation of the tea appeared almost simultaneously during the second week of October in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. The timing of these essays means that the individual authors could not have been aware of what others were arguing. And indeed, they argued different things. These were 3 essays, one in Boston, one in Philadelphia, and actually 2 in Philadelphia, one in New York. And they all argue different things but they all say, let's oppose the tea in some way. So one of them says we should oppose the landing of the tea. One of them says we should renew our boycott of the tea. We should go back to we should start up the boycott again. And one of them says we should force the designated tea agents to resign. And that one turns out to be important. We should force the designated tea agents to resign. Now, following this flurry of essays in the second week of October, crucial meetings took place in New York and Philadelphia. The Philadelphia gathering was the most important because there a large group of citizens adopted not one but several resolutions that were later to serve as the model for other statements by other areas. The Philadelphians based their position firmly on the principle that they described this way, quote, the disposal of their own property is the inherent right of freemen, and that may mean property holders, the inherent right of freemen, and that there can be no property in that which another can of right take from us without our consent. So in other words, it's about consenting to the taxes. Now, from that declaration flowed the assertions that the tea duty was a tax levy to which Americans had not consented because, after all, they didn't elect anybody to Parliament and they had no voice in the passage of this law. And also that it was every American freeman's responsibility to, quote, offer a virtuous and steady opposition to the violent attack upon the liberties of America that was represented by the planned tea imports. And they said any man who aided and abetted that enterprise was, quote, an enemy to his country. Now, there's a pattern here, perhaps in hindsight, a surprising one. Initially, New Yorkers and Philadelphians, especially the mercantile community in both cities, took the lead in opposing the EIC's imports. In mid-October 1773, Charleston residents, not yet realizing that tea was being dispatched to this port, were entirely silent. I found no letters from the period mentioning it. I found no newspaper articles mentioning it from that period. Charleston just doesn't seem to care as long as the tea is not coming here. It's the people in the north are concerned about it, but Charleston isn't. And although the Bostonians knew the EICT was coming, remember, that was where it said, the initial letter, they seemed remarkably complacent about it. No meetings were convened in Boston to talk about opposing the tea. In fact, there were complaints in the newspapers that no meetings had been convened in Boston to oppose the tea. And in a circular letter to the other colonies in late October, Samuel Adams, who we think of as the great fiery radical opposing the tea, commented only briefly on the Tea Act at the end of a very long letter that was largely devoted to other topics. I mean, if you read this letter, as I did, it's kind of, by the way, at the end, oh, there's this Tea Act, and we need to think about how to oppose it, but nothing about, let's, to the barricades or anything like that. It's just not there. But at the end of the month of October, one of the Philadelphia essays, the one that urged people to attack the tea consignees, was reprinted in Boston, and there are some people who say that's what encouraged the Bostonians to actually take some steps for the first time. It seems to have had a great impact, at least contemporary people argue that it did. Activists then targeted the consignees in Boston, the men who had been designated by the East India Company to receive the tea. Among them was the firm of Richard Clark and Sons, of whom you will hear some more later. On the evening of the 1st of November, anti-tea activists in Boston delivered letters to the tea consignees asking them to resign their positions. The consignees refused to comply, and they continued to resist resignation, even in the face of a formal request for that from a large town meeting 4 days later on the 5th of November. That same town meeting proceeded to adopt the Philadelphia resolutions of the previous month. So resolutions had been adopted in Philadelphia on the 16th of October. This is a little bit more than 2 weeks later. The Bostonians say, quote, the words of certain judicious resolves lately entered into by our worthy brethren, the citizens of Philadelphia, end quote, perfectly express their views. So they adopt that. So this reveals that the Bostonians at this time were followers, not leaders, in the movement to resist the tea imports. They're just following along in the wake of the Philadelphians. Now, by early November, the merchants designated as tea agents in both Philadelphia and New York City came under pressure to resign, just like the ones in Boston. The Philadelphia firms all eventually did resign, some sooner than others. In New York, they also resigned, but the governor of New York, William Tryon, didn't want to give up the idea of landing the tea, and so he considered landing and storing the tea under government protection. Even though the consignees wouldn't take it, he started thinking about how to do this, how to get the tea, when the tea ship arrived, how to get the tea off the ship and land it and store it. And he had a useful ally. He had an ally named the Reverend John Vardill, who was an Anglican priest and a professor at King's College. And he began publishing pro-East India Company broadsides and essays. I want to devote a little time to what the Reverend Vardill had to say, because we rarely hear that any Americans, other than the tea agents and government officials, supported the imports. And here was an opinion leader, shall we say, in New York City, who was publishing a bunch of broadsides and newspaper essays about why the tea should be received. So what did Vardill say? Well, he said, the East India Company is a commercial enterprise that performs a vital function for the British Empire. He also argued that the tea was better than smuggled Dutch tea. This is one of the little debates that goes on during this. Which tea is better? Are we, that the East India Company tea is really better than the Dutch tea, and so you should buy that instead of the smuggled Dutch tea. Now, what is funny, though, is that then the people who were opposed to the tea said, no, we're only going to get the dregs of the East India Company tea. And in fact, I recently saw a document, this is after I had prepared this talk, I recently saw a document indicating that indeed that was right, that the East India Company told the people who were actually shipping the tea to America, to pick from the warehouse tea that had been rejected by British buyers, but not the worst of the tea. So the middling level of tea is what you're going to send to America, not the horrible tea, but the middling level, but things that have been rejected at the auctions by British buyers. I thought that was great when I saw that. Anyway, so Vardal, in addition, insisted that British and colonial interests were intertwined and could not be easily separated. And he also questioned, and this is an interesting point, whether any true patriot should really encourage smugglers and lawbreakers. Because after all, if you're not buying legal tea, it's not saying you shouldn't buy tea. You're going to buy smuggled tea. And, you know, we're all really law-abiding citizens here, and we shouldn't be buying smuggled tea that earns money for lawbreakers. But most importantly, I think, he warned his fellow New Yorkers against what he called was, quote, the arbitrary encroachments of men who were assuming the power to coerce others. Quote, every friend to liberty must be alarmed at such procedures, he declared. So he's talking about the kind of attacks that were occurring on the tea consignees, because they were, you know, Richard Clark's windows at his warehouse were broken, and there was a mob, you know, that beat on the doors and so forth, while he and his friends were inside. So Vardal says, no, this is wrong. Quote, while we are watchful against external attacks on our freedom, let us be on our guard lest we become enslaved by dangerous tyrants within, by which he meant the people who were opposed to landing the tea. Now, that last argument would be echoed for years by others who opposed American resistance to British authority. Many contended that the tyranny of the colonial crowd was worse than the tyranny of Britain. In the same way, an essayist responding to Vardal, because it wasn't as though he didn't get answered, people responded to him in broadsides and newspapers in New York City. An essayist responding to him previewed other later similar replies to the contentions of dissenters. Quote, when any man or set of men set themselves in opposition to the general interest of the community of which they are members, and thereby deprive their countrymen and fellow citizens of their just rights and liberties, they tacitly declare themselves the enemies of the community, and must therefore disclaim all right to that protection and security which they otherwise would be justly entitled to, end quote. So Vardal's argument and that reply revealed the crux of the debate that would rage for years in the colonies and the new nation, and indeed I think can be said to divide Americans to this day. How far do the rights of dissenters extend? If men chose to oppose a consensus of their fellow colonists, did they deserve the protection of the community, or rather the condemnation of the community? Of course, in late 1773, the will of the community could not be expressed by voting or indeed through its local established authority, but it could only be expressed through what Vardal and others termed the tyranny of the mob. And so the question was, how do you decide? How do you decide? Do you protect dissenters, or do you coerce them into not dissenting anymore? Now, while the broadside wars raged in New York, residents of Charleston finally learned that a tea ship would soon arrive in the harbor. Remember, I said 15th of November. So on the 15th of November, Peter Timothy, who was the editor of one of the 3 local papers here in Charleston, told his readers that he had learned that tea was on its way to South Carolina. It's interesting, it's not something reprinted from another newspaper, and he doesn't tell what his source is. He just says, I have a source that tells me that tea is coming here too. And that's on the 15th of November. A week later, he revealed the name of the ship. The ship was called the London, and its captain was a man named Alexander Curling. I'll talk about this in a minute. Now, in late November, so about 2 weeks after he announced this, Timothy printed an incendiary essay in his newspaper. This essay insisted, quote, a tax of the value of 1 penny levied upon us without our consent as effectually takes away our liberty as if the sum were $1,000,000. It is not the value of the tax we object to, but the principle on which it was laid. I'll repeat that because that's the important point. It's not the value of the tax. We don't care how much it is. If it's a penny, it's too much if we didn't vote for it. So it's the principle on which it was laid to which they are objecting. So the anonymous author summoned up the an image of the future to help make his case. He referred to our children and grandchildren. He said, they will curse the folly of their forefathers if we submit to tyranny. And this is kind of a common theme in these kinds of essays, where the people who are opposed to the landing of the T are trying to rev up their fellow colonists, and they're saying, think of our posterity, think of our descendants, they will be upset with us if we do not take this step and support American liberty. Okay, there we are, late November, and then the first T ships arrived. So, on November 28th, the Dartmouth, captained by James Hall, sailed into Boston Harbor, followed by 2 other vessels over the next 3 days. On December 2nd, just a few days later, the ship London tied up at a Charleston wharf after having reached the harbor entrance the previous day. Ironically, the vagaries of the Atlantic crossing meant that Philadelphia and New York, the cities that had taken the lead in the initial opposition to the T, would not lead in dealing with its actual presence. The Polly, under Captain Ayres, did not reach the Delaware River, this is the ship going to Philadelphia, until December 25th, so almost a month after the first ships got to Boston. And the Nancy, bound for New York under Captain Lockyer, did not arrive at the entrance to New York Harbor until mid-April 1774, months later, because it was blown off course by a North Atlantic gale, and it spent the winter in the Caribbean on the island of Antigua, which, by the way, many of us in the Northeast wish we had been in Antigua this winter. Now, a 4th vessel that was dispatched to Boston, the William, under Captain Joseph Loring, was shipwrecked on Cape Cod. And that's probably the same storm that affected the Nancy. And that's the story of the 7th T ship that I talked about earlier, and which I'll come back to later. Okay, so even here in Charleston, I suspect the Charleston events are not nearly as familiar as those in Boston. There have been two whole books about the Boston Tea Party, and many articles. I have found one article about Charleston, about what happened in Charleston. So it's this real difference in the coverage of these events. So I'm going to start with Charleston. And I'm going to describe what happened here in December 1773 at some length. The crucial fact is, and I want to make this clear to everybody, events unfolded here nearly simultaneously with the events in Boston. And because of the slow transmission of information, neither city knew what the other was doing. And that's what makes it so interesting. Yet the same legal imperative drove the residents of both towns. So what was that legal imperative? Well, under British customs laws, duty had to be paid within 20 days of a ship's arrival in a harbor, or customs officials would confiscate the cargo for non-payment. Furthermore, once a ship had formally entered the harbor, it could not leave without paying the duty. That meant that in both cities, the confrontation between opponents of the tea imports and local authorities or tea consignees could not continue indefinitely. There was a time limit. In Boston, the 20 days were going to be up on the 17th of December. In Charleston, 5 days later, on the 22nd of December. So those are the crucial dates to keep in mind. The 17th of December in Boston, and the 22nd of December in Charleston, and those are, in fact, you'll see important dates in both these, in the stories to come. Now, as soon as Captain Curling arrived here with 257 chests of tea on the London, organizers posted handbills all over Charleston asking, quote, all the inhabitants without exception to gather the next day for a meeting. That's very unusual. Didn't ask for voters, didn't ask for freemen, asked for everybody. But by everybody, they clearly meant white men. There's no indication that any enslaved people were there, and there's no indication that any women were there. Nobody remarked on anybody other than white men at this meeting. But in any event, they were to gather on the 3rd of December in the large meeting room on the 2nd floor of the Mercantile Exchange, which I'm sure all of you have been in. I've been in it. Newspaper reports later claimed that so many people assembled that, quote, the main beams of the building started to give way. Now, whether this meant that some people left or not, I don't know. It does seem to be an exaggeration, and it does seem to be unlikely, but it certainly does suggest that the meeting was extremely well attended, perhaps because it was so unique, because everybody, at least everybody who counted, that is, white men, were actually invited to this meeting. Now, Peter Timothy, remember he's the newspaper editor, his later description of the meeting, long piece in the newspaper, described, quote, calm deliberation that readily achieved a consensus. But I want to point out that his is not the only contemporary account. Letters, and even one newspaper in the North, reported that it actually started with heated debates, during which some attendees defended the East India Company's right to send tea to South Carolina. Lieutenant Governor William Bull, who headed the colony in the absence of a governor, commented that opinions at the meeting were, quote, various, and that, quote, many were cool to the idea of opposing the tea imports. Now, I want to make an observation about Peter Timothy's account of the meeting. He was clearly there, but his failure to include reports of such disagreements in that account alerts us to the need to be wary of relying on colonial newspapers alone for information about American opinion with respect to the tea ships or the developing political crisis generally. Most editors in the colonies, like Peter Timothy, supported resistance to Britain. Only a few colonial newspapers either took Britain's side openly or tried to remain neutral as the political contest became more heated. As I said, Timothy was clearly at this meeting. He was clearly there. Yet his published narrative suppressed the information that not everyone there enthusiastically supported the anti-tea ship agenda of its organizers. Newspaper editors at the time primarily advanced their own viewpoints instead of reporting the news objectively. We could think of the news reporting in the colonies as sort of like MSNBC versus Fox News. You know, you get a slanted political view from each of them about the events of the day. Now, according to Peter Timothy, and I'll come back to an issue about whether he was right or not, according to Peter Timothy, those present approved a request that local merchants agree not to import duty-paying tea. The Carolina tea consignees attended the meeting to explain that they had resigned. Peter Timothy tells us this was an announcement that was greeted with loud shouts of applause, which is probably true. By December 6th, when he published this account that I'm talking about, more than 50 merchants had reportedly agreed not to import duty-paying tea. Moreover, the editor indicated other residents had pledged not to buy duty tea or to purchase any items from people who imported it. Now, Captain Curling attended the meeting, and he found himself confronted with a dilemma because the consignees, of course, had refused to accept the tea. He had a load of tea on his ship. He was supposed to carry other stuff back to England. What was he supposed to do with the tea? So he asked the gathering, what am I supposed to do with this tea? And he was told to keep the tea on board his ship and take it back to England. That's what the group told him. Now, so therefore, the initial decision in Charleston was apparently to resolve the problem presented by the arrival of the tea by adopting a threefold strategy. With no agents willing to accept the tea, with no merchants willing to sell it, and no purchasers willing to buy it, Curling's only option appeared to him and others to be returning to England with that part of his cargo. Now, interestingly enough, those potential purchasers of tea explicitly included women. We do have that. There's an essay in one of the newspapers, in Peter Timothy's newspaper actually, one of the attendees at the meeting addressed the, quote, dear ladies of Charleston, arguing that drinking tea was bad for their health, after all, and would lead to nervous disorder, so they should avoid it. And I might add that this is another pretty common argument that's made at this time. You know, you want to get women to stop drinking tea, you say, it's bad for you, so. No one, I also want to emphasize something else. Nobody at this meeting appears to have proposed resisting the landing of the tea by force. There is nobody that says. They say there's different opinions, but nobody says we should, throw the tea in the harbor or do something like that. But then the results of the December 3rd meeting were soon disputed. And here's where Drayton Hall comes in, because actually William Henry Drayton's memoir of this period, and he's the son of John Drayton, the owner of Drayton Hall, William Henry Drayton actually is one of the good sources for this. He says, in fact, after this meeting, and Peter Timothy's saying, we've made this decision, Drayton says, no, that's not what happened. Everybody started to dispute it and said, no, we didn't reach that decision at that meeting. And he says there's a lot more disagreement than anybody had admitted. And that did indeed turn out to be the case. The question was, what had really been decided at this meeting? And the question that appeared really quickly was, had Charleston residents agreed to boycott every bit of tea, smuggled tea as well as duty-paying tea, or only the duty-paying tea from the East India Company? Now, if they'd agreed to boycott all tea, that would affect all the merchants, the people who sold the smuggled tea, the people who had themselves ordered tea from the East India Company, but privately was not part of this big shipment that came in on the London. That would affect them as well as the people who were selling, the consignees. Or if they didn't do this, then smugglers would have the advantage if the agreement only forbade people to sell legally imported tea from the East India Company. Now, it's not difficult to imagine the conversations that must have taken place in Charleston's counting houses, that's what the mercantile offices were called, in the days after the meeting on the 3rd of December. As a result, less than a week later, local merchants formed the Charleston Chamber of Commerce, which aimed, quote, to extend commerce, encourage industry, and adjust disputes relative to trade and navigation. Now, at that very moment, of course, the prime example of a dispute that needed adjustment sat visibly at the wharf in the harbor in the form of the tea cargo on the ship London. So, in short, it becomes obvious in Charleston that the seeming consensus of the December 3rd meeting had collapsed, if indeed one ever existed. And we see in the newspapers reports that planters, artisans, and merchants all met separately on the 15th and 16th of December. And I don't know what went on in these meetings. I found no notes or anything, and all there is in the newspapers is, the planters are meeting today, the merchants are meeting today, the artisans are meeting today. That's all it says. I don't know what happened in the meetings. But opinion in Charleston had obviously fragmented, so they needed another meeting of all the inhabitants to reestablish or establish a consensus. And so it convened again at the Exchange, but this time it says on the lower level, so they're not upstairs. Well, maybe it really was true that there were so many people up there that the beams were giving away. I don't know. In any way, it explicitly says meet at the lower level on the 17th of December. Now, at this meeting, again, we've got this account from William Henry Drayton about comments that are made at this meeting. And I kind of think he wrote this account later in life, and so I think his memory kind of failed him. But he has this one wonderful moment where he says, one of the people who got up in the meeting said, at the very time we were having the meeting on the 3rd of December to decide not to import, or supposedly not to import, East India Company tea, there was tea being unloaded from ships in the harbor, and the very cart passed by the outside of our meeting and the Exchange. And so what are we to do? What are we to do? And so the participants at this meeting on the 17th of December adopted a resolution that I think was almost certainly proposed by the leaders of the new Chamber of Commerce. And here's the resolution that was adopted, quote, that it is the sense of this body that no tea ought to be imported from any place whatsoever while the act remains unrepealed, end quote. Now, in one sense, it was irrational to tie all tea imports to the duty laid on some tea imports, but in another, doing so was essential to achieving a crucial consensus among the Charleston merchants. Now, perhaps the anti-tea forces devoted too much time to considering how to prohibit the sale of all tea and too little to strategizing about how to avoid the looming deadline of December 22nd. Remember, this meeting took place on the 17th. Lieutenant Governor Bull was determined not to forget that deadline and to facilitate the seizure and storage of the tea by the customs collector. And he urged the collector to move first. Accordingly, very early on the morning of December 22nd, customs officers unloaded the 257 chests of tea, and they stored them in the cellar under the Exchange. Peter Timothy later claimed in his newspaper that they worked so rapidly that the task was finished before most people even realized that it had begun. He was obviously trying to excuse the laxity of Charlestonians in allowing this to happen. But there's reason for us to be skeptical about his account. I have discovered, I've seen the invoice. There were 182 large chests of tea. Each weighed 350 pounds. There were 75 small chests, each weighed an average of 70 pounds. One account reported that by noon the chests had been offloaded, but that many were still sitting on the wharf. But no one resisted. Now, subsequently, Peter Timothy said Charleston residents, quote, confidently rely on its remaining locked up in the cellar where it is now lodged, and either until the EIC ordered it reshipped to England or until the duty was repealed. Now, evidently, the quality of the tea deteriorated badly because of the damp cellar in which it was stored. It's later reported to have been sold to benefit the war effort, but some people just say it just moldered away. If anybody here knows what happened to this tea, I'd like to know, because the sources are completely different. Some say it's sold later, some say it just disappears. Okay, so now back to Boston. So just as in Charleston, the arrival of the first vessel on Sunday, the November 28th, triggered a call for an immediate meeting. Residents were directed to assemble at Faneuil Hall at 9 o'clock in the morning to discuss tactics. So many people showed up, the meeting was moved to the largest space in town. The Bostonians have a 2-day meeting. They voted unanimously to prevent the tea from landing and to ensure it was sent back to England. And they did something the Charleston residents had neglected to do. They set up a 24-hour watch on the wharf to make certain that chests were not removed from the ships. And that's, of course, a crucial thing that the Charleston people didn't do. Now, that the confrontation was going to end in the way that it did in Boston was not immediately foreseeable. During the period before the ominous deadline of the 17th of December, Bostonians kept trying various tactics to get the tea ships to leave the harbor. They repeatedly approached customs officers, the consignees, the ship owners, the British Navy, and the governor to have the vessels depart without either paying the duty or unloading their cargoes. But Hutchinson stood firm, that's the governor, insisting on enforcing the law, as did the other representatives of imperial authority. Remember that once a ship had entered the harbor, it could not legally depart until it paid customs duties, and there was no sense of them paying customs duties. So in Boston, unlike Charleston, a clear consensus had been achieved. You all know the outside of what happened. On December 16th, the night before the end of the 20-day deadline, Bostonians and others again gathered at Old South Church. When the final negotiations with the governor failed, the participants did not trust customs officers to confiscate and store the tea, as happened in Charleston 6 days later. So a large group of men, crudely disguised as Indians, boarded the 3 ships, destroyed 342 chests of tea. That is literally 46 tons of tea. 46 tons of tea floating in Boston Harbor, worth more than 9,000 pounds. Somebody asked me, what does that mean in current money? The best I can estimate, it's about $180,000 worth of tea in 2014 dollars. So they threw it all into the harbor. Now, the next morning, the Boston Committee of Correspondence dispatched its messenger, Paul Revere, south to New York City, and then on to Philadelphia with the electrifying news. Revere arrived in New York on the 21st of December, and in Philadelphia on the 24th of December, shortly before the tea ship Polly arrived. So when the Polly arrived, Philadelphians knew that New Englanders had destroyed the tea sent to them, and they knew that but they had less current information about what had happened in Charleston. They didn't know that the customs collector had seized the tea in Charleston 5 days earlier. They just knew that Charleston had voted to send the tea back. So the leaders of Philadelphia anti-tea forces were smart. They realized that what had caused the problem in both Boston and Charleston was the 20-day deadline. And so they decided they couldn't allow the captain to register the cargo at the customs house. That simple step would avoid those problems. So they addressed a broadside to the pilots on the Delaware River. To get the ship into the harbor, you had to have the pilots in the Delaware River. And they enjoined them against assisting the vessel in any way on pain of tar and feathers. This is a great broadside. They give a description of the ship. They give a description of the captain, and they say, "Don't you dare help these people." And so when the ship did get within 18 miles of the city, they knew it, and they intercepted the captain. And they brought them into town, and they convinced them not to try to land the cargo or to report it at the customs house. There's no account in the newspapers as to what they threatened the captain with, but I would like to have heard that conversation. They just say, "Oh, he agreed." And so, after less than 48 hours and following another large meeting, the captain left to return to the ship. And get this one, quote, this is what it said in the paper, "attended to the wharf by a large concourse of people who wish them a good voyage." I could just see people say, "Hey, bye, we're so glad you're leaving. We're glad you're not here. Have a good trip back to England." I love that. Wish them a good voyage. Anyway, so New York's tea ship, the story of New York is pretty much the same, because by the time the ship arrived in New York in the spring of 1774, they all knew what had happened. So New York had three alternatives. They could destroy the tea as in Boston, they could land and store the tea as in Charleston, or they could prevent the tea from entering the harbor as in Philadelphia. And unsurprisingly, they decided there's less problem in doing the last, and so that's what they do. Everybody in New York decides we're not going to let the ship enter the harbor. The captain knows what had happened too, so he too says, "I'm not going to try to enter the harbor." He wrote a letter in advance saying, "I'm coming, but hey, I'm only going to resupply the ship and I'm heading right back to England." And so that's exactly what happened. And so he arrived off the coast on the 19th of April. He's greeted at the dock by a whole bunch of people. They pronounce him, quote, "a sensible, discreet, and very well-bred man," because he's very cooperative. And they send him off with, quote, "loud huzzas and the firing of many guns." So they're really happy too. But the worst luck of all, I have to tell you about I know I'm almost out of time, but I have to tell you about the shipwreck because it's so interesting. As I say, it was shipwrecked on Cape Cod, and it's only from that shipwreck did any tea from the East India Company reach American consumers. The ship only carried 58 chests of tea, and the ship that was wrecked was a total loss, but they offloaded as much of the tea as they could save. 4 tea chests were damaged beyond repair. One was reloaded into something else. One was opened, and the contents were used to pay the men who helped unload and move the cargo. And I should say there was other cargo on board the vessel, including street lamps for Boston, which actually did make it to Boston. That cargo was intact. And then 2 were given to a guy who helped unload, who was a merchant, local merchant on the Cape, a man named John Greenough, to compensate him for his trouble. The chests that were salvaged were sent to Castle William, which was the Army headquarters in Boston, on an island in the Boston harbor, and they were sent in a hired Salem fishing schooner. There was a fishing schooner in Provincetown Harbor, and they hired it to take the tea up to Boston, the remaining tea. The schooner arrived and offloaded the tea, which was stored under the protection of customs officers at on that island, and I don't know what happened to it there. Probably the British officers drank it. The captain and the owner of the ship then faced the fury of their fellow countrymen, and this is actually one of my favorite stories. The ship owner of this fishing schooner decided this was a wonderful time to be inoculated against smallpox. Now, if any of you know, smallpox inoculation involved not a vaccination, but actually getting a mild case of the disease. So he went off into the smallpox hospital in Salem. And when people, quote, disguised as Indians, were going to attack him, they suddenly realized, oh my God, if we go in here, we might get smallpox. So they stopped. So he saved himself from attack from the Indians by being in the smallpox hospital. I love that story. The captain managed to convince the Salem town meeting that he'd been totally ignorant. He knew nothing of what was going on, and so he'd taken the tea up to Boston without knowing what was happening. Now, the same couldn't be said of John Greenough, because John Greenough became involved in months of controversy with his fellow residents of the Cape and with members of his own family. And there's a long correspondence back and forth with his father in Boston. He says, I think I should be able to sell this tea. It didn't pay any duty. And his father says, no, you can't sell it. and back and forth and back and forth. As the winter of 1774 turned into spring, the towns on the Cape were sharply divided. There were town meetings, there were mobs, the militia was called out, and the whole question was what to do with this tea, because he had a chest, he ended up with one chest of the tea. Could it be sold? If so, who could sell it? Those were the big questions. And it went on for months. I'm probably going to write an article about this story. And finally, Greenough managed to sell some of it. I have no idea how he managed to sell some of it. We also know that some of the people, who I said were paid in the tea to help unload the cargo, they sold some of their tea. And we know, and there's a story that some of that tea got as far as Connecticut, but I don't know how to track it. But anyway, there was some tea that was sold, maybe 100 pounds worth of tea, maybe, and that's it, of these thousands of pounds and thousands of pounds of tea that was sent to America. Okay, so what can we conclude from this? I have three conclusions. First, and perhaps most obviously, Bostonian solution to the problem of what to do with the East India tea was not the only or even the most frequently selected option. Boston was the outlier, because in that city, the consignees, customs and civil officials, and anti-tea forces remained at odds and unable to reach a compromise. In Charleston, when the lieutenant governor and the customs officers took the initiative to seize and store the tea, people did not object. In Philadelphia, the people and the tea ship captain concurred that the vessel should not enter the harbor. And in New York, officials agreed to the same strategy. In short, violent destruction of the tea was not inevitable in 1773. Second, opposition to importing tea was by no means universal. In all four ports, and for various reasons, men and probably women challenged the anti-tea movement or raised significant questions about the utility of the chosen tactics. Merchants who sold EIC tea had different interests from those who sold smuggled Dutch tea. Some groups and individuals declared publicly or privately that the company should be able to sell its tea in America and that the opposition movement could be tyrannical, perhaps more so than Parliament or the ministry. And third and finally, even though tea symbolically represented Britain's disputed right to tax Americans, people still wanted to sell, buy, and drink it if they could. The residents of a few towns of Cape Cod reached the benefits of these desires. And so, in short, we can conclude Americans' attractions to a desirable commodity, for which we have many modern examples, is nothing new under the sun. Thank you. Now, I did run over, and I know Steve wants to start the reception, but if anybody has a question that now, instead of waiting for afterwards, I'm happy to answer any questions later, but yeah, go ahead.
Where on the Cape did the ship wreck?
Well, that's a really good question. It is somewhere near Provincetown, but I've been unable to discover. I've read every newspaper account of it, but it's clearly the closest place is Provincetown, because that's where they take it when they unload the cargo. Yeah, no, the merchant's actually in Wellfleet, but the ship, the cargo ends up in Provincetown, and I wish I could get a more specific information. I've tried, I've looked, but there's no, it's on what they call the back side of the Cape, so in other words, the Atlantic side. It's not inside the bay, it's on the outside of the Cape, but that's as close as I can get. Maybe I can find more information. I'm still hoping to find. I know there's a couple of letters that Richard Clark and Sons, who owned that vessel, wrote to the East India Company. I just haven't seen those yet because they're in the East India Company records and they haven't been published. Gosh, I have to go to London to read them. Isn't that a shame? So I don't know yet, but I'm going to try to find out. But anyway, it's close to Provincetown. Right close to the tip. Any other general questions? Yeah, in the back.
Is there any difference between, we all know that there's tea and tea and tea.
Right.
Is there a difference between the tea that was brought by the East India Company, i.e. British, and the tea that came from the Dutch sources?
From the Dutch, yeah. Well, of course.
That's one question.
Yeah,
the
sure.
second question is more humorous.
Yeah.
What are the fish in the Boston?
Yeah, right. There's been no account of what happened to the fish. I'm sorry. I wish I knew. But on the issue of the kind of tea, yes, we don't know what kind of tea was the smuggled tea because, after all, that was smuggled and it's not recorded. The East India Company tea did come in different qualities. And when I said there were these large chests and small chests, the large chests were what's called Bohea tea, B-O-H-E-A, and that's ordinary black tea. But they also had small chests of much better quality, green tea. Some of it was called Hyson, H-Y-S-O-N. And there's another type of tea that's of very high quality called Singlo, and another one called Kongu. And I don't know about those. I know that Hyson is green tea, and I know that Bohea is the ordinary black tea. But other than that, I haven't yet investigated sufficiently to know what those other varieties of tea are. But I do know that most of the tea that the East India Company sent was Bohea, and that's what most Americans drank because the other stuff was really quite expensive. The Bohea tea sold for about 2 shillings a pound, which of course is a lot cheaper than we have today, even with inflation and everything. The Hyson could sell for as much as 7 or 8 shillings a pound, and then some of the other varieties were even more. So I just don't know what the Dutch smuggled tea was. There's just no indication about it. So, other questions? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Right. Right. Yes. Okay, so here's the question. She asks, were the consequences of the Boston Tea Party that you were talking about the intolerable acts? And the answer is yes, you're right. When Parliament heard what had happened in Boston, they really ignored what had happened in Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia, and they focused on Boston, and they passed a series of laws punishing Boston. And these became known as the intolerable acts. So, great. Good for you. Any other?
Just a factor about that.
Yeah.
You may notice that William Bull was the uncle of William Henry Drayton.
Yeah, no, yes, he was, right. And William Henry Drayton had previously been an ally of the governor, but he broke with the governor on these issues, yeah, right. Anything else?
Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thanks, yeah.